the D.C. Commission, there's been a special commission was assembled to review. It was called the D.C. Faces Working Group Recommendations, and this was to review the statues and memorials that exist in Washington, D.C. Logan, tell everybody a little bit of what was going on here first. When you see the list, folks, it's shocking.
Yeah, you see this list. Again, this is coming from DC Faces, which is an organization that the mayor and some of the other people involved in the government in DC have put together, so the parks and everything. And they put out a whole list, a whole document of statues, memorials, schools that they believe should be either replaced, removed, or explained, essentially put a reason why this should exist and to put it into its contextualized, essentially put it into context. And the list is pretty debatable, I'd say the least. There are a few on there.
Yeah, a couple. There's
a few on there that I think we go through and you'll go, okay, yeah, I think that's okay to be changed. I think in 2020 we can look at that and go, there was definitely some evil involved. But you look at the main list and you're talking about the Washington Monument, the George Washington statue that's along the George Washington Monument, Christopher Columbus, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, the Jefferson Memorial. And again, the options that are on the table right now are remove and replace and essentially contextualize these monuments. And what's interesting is the president actually has been saying this for years, and people laughed at it, that eventually they were going to not just come for, look, I think there's been a lot of debate on the Confederate monuments and those type of things.
These aren't the Confederate monuments.
That's what I'm saying. I think those at least is a discussion that can be had.
Yes.
How are you going to move the Washington Monument? I feel like just the physics of that is going to be very difficult. And look, not to say that there isn't some conversation that should again be had about some of these people, but you're talking about George Washington, you're talking about Thomas Jefferson, you're talking about the founding fathers of the country.
Yeah. So look, nobody is perfect. We know that, and here you have a situation where they are talking about, and this is what's so clear here. It says the federal government will remove, relocate, they're asking for this to be done, or contextualize the following assets. They don't say which should be removed and which should be relocated or which should be contextualized.
Yeah, that's
but the idea that, and the president did say they're going to be, I remember when he said it, they're going to be attacking the Jefferson Monument, the Jefferson Memorial. Well, they are. They're going to attack the Washington Monument. Well, they are. Now, here's the problem. This is a cancellation culture. No, our history is not perfect, but it is our history. And history matters. We're going to be joined after the break by Dr. Andrew Economo. Our senior lawyer is also a PhD in history. We're going to be joined by Harry Hutchison, our senior policy director. I want to quickly go to Than Bennett and get a reaction.
Well, Jay, it's a city I love, a country I love. The idea that the contributions of George Washington to this city and this country are now somehow worthy of shame, it's just beyond me, Jay. And I'll just quickly say this, though. She's got a jurisdiction issue because some of these city buildings, city schools, yeah, they can unilaterally rename them. But these federal monuments, Jay, she has no jurisdiction to rename those. Those go through the federal government. And just for the record, the Interior Secretary says, not on my watch, never going to happen.
And then, Andy, I noticed, first of all, give me your general reaction to this.
Horror.
Yeah, what you can say, and just make sure it's something you can say on the radio.
Yes, go ahead,
Well,
Andy.
It's the worst that I can come up with that I can say on the radio, and that is horror. Because I am a practicing historian as well as a practicing lawyer, and I see what we're trying to do is to rewrite the past and to take out of context the American dream and the American inheritance. I mean, for all you say about Thomas Jefferson, he's the author of the Declaration of Independence, the President of the United States, Secretary of State, George Washington, yes, he had ideas that are not consistent with what we do in the 21st century, but he was the founder of the country in the sense that he led the army of the revolution against the British. And what are we going to do? As Logan said, just the physics. Are we going to blow up the monument? Are we going to blow up the needle? I mean, what kind of outrageous ideas are we coming up with? And what does contextualized means? That to me is a leftist word for destroy and to denigrate something and to minimize it. This is something that I can't. It's so difficult for me to express into words. Look, the present is a text. The past is its interpretation. In order to understand where we are, we have to look at where we have been, not destroy what we had.
And this is interesting because actually in the list, it gives you sort of the qualifications of what they decided who should have their name replaced. And some of them, like I said, we can go through all of them. Christopher Columbus, Benjamin Franklin. There's some you wouldn't know on this list that maybe if you did look at their history, you're like, maybe, top Klansmen we shouldn't be naming a school after. I get that. I'm in support of that. But in general, some of these names that we're very familiar with, there's a reason. What is really interesting is of sort of the 5 imperatives, one of them is the violation of the district's human rights laws, their current laws.
So the current D.C. human rights laws,
if they said, did research and evidence find the namesake committed a violation of the D.C. Human Rights Act in whole or part, including discrimination against protected traits such as age, religion, sexual orientation, gender identity, and natural origin? We're talking about people from the 1700s.
Yeah, so you're taking the D.C. Human Rights Code, which I think, we could look this up, I believe was like some of it was in like the late 1970s maybe.
We can find it. Still.
I say that? Okay. I still remember.
So,
yeah, the first one was 1977. So we're only going to go back
under 50 years
from 1977 to 1776. All right?
Right.
I mean, it's not just revisionist history. It's really absurd. And they're going to apply retroactively the D.C. Human Rights Statute to our founders?
I mean, that's what it says. Pretty clear as day.
Well, then have no monuments to any men because only men could vote.
Yeah, but no monuments. I mean, really, honestly, like I said, everyone is flawed. But to view people through a lens of today is nearly impossible for someone who was, by the way, famous 15 years ago, much less someone famous 200 years ago. They also are talking about renaming, and they said this is using the existing process to rename the following public schools. Obviously, you have some of those names that we've brought up before. You have names like Alexander Graham Bell. You have names like Thomas Jefferson, Francis Scott Key.
What did Alexander Graham Bell do?
I'd have to look it up. I don't know what egregions he did. I mean, it could be terrible. I don't know a lot about him.
He did come up with a telephone.
Well, I know that part. Yeah, that's a good part. That's something you should celebrate for sure. We're still using those today, I hear. There's also, John Tyler, a lot of presidents on this list. Zachary Taylor. So this is not just applying, though the monuments are the easiest for you to look at and go, well, that's the absurdity of it, because they're talking about, again, removing, replacing, or contextualizing what buildings that are, let's just put our gigantic.
But then if you walk out of our office, you would start removing things block by block. I mean, literally outside our door. I guess outside our door is the United States Capitol too.
It would open up some new city parks, Jay. I mean, because there would be nothing but trees left in the blocks surrounding it. And look, I would say a couple of things, and Logan touched on this, but these monuments are why people come to the city in the first place, to learn. Second, many of these monuments don't even belong to the city. This report that we're talking about specifically acknowledges that they belong to the federal government. And Jay, the other thing, and you want to talk about retroactive application of D.C. law, I sure hope this week or next week I don't violate some D.C. law that they're going to pass in the 22nd century or the 23rd century long after I'm gone, because that'd be pretty hard, Jay, to abide by laws that aren't written as I'm living today. But that's what we're looking at here.
Andy, the retroactive application of laws is usually deemed unconstitutional.
It is ex post facto laws. In other words, making it a crime today that something was not a crime yesterday, or telling me without giving me notice, if you walk up those steps, when you get to the one that I'm thinking of, that's criminal, and if you step on it, you've committed a crime. But you do not criminalize activity that was not criminal when it was committed. And none of these things were criminal when they were committed. They may have been antisocial, they may have been immoral. Slavery was a horrible thing. We Greeks were living under the Turkish boot for 400 years. Does that mean that we have to destroy every mosque in Greece because the Turks were there? No, it doesn't mean that. Does it also mean that the Turks should destroy every church in Turkey and make it into a mosque? Certainly not. We have to be realists in our history. We have to appreciate and understand the reality of what history means. History is the story of the human past, with all its dirt, it's good, it's bad, it's evil, it's right, it's wrong. That's what it is. You don't ignore it. You don't destroy it. You live with it and you understand it. And most important, you learn from it.
Because of your support, because of the support of every member of the ACLJ, one of the practice areas that we've been able to develop is Freedom of Information Act requests, or FOIA requests.
It's thousands of pages of paper, and in those thousands of pages of paper, you usually find a nugget.
Government agencies acting out of control.
We have exposed that in our FOIA litigation, and we do that every day that we bring these cases.
It is your statutory right as an American citizen to have access to documents that reveal how the government is functioning, how your government is functioning.
We took it to the IRS. No one ever does that.
What the IRS was doing was violating the Constitution and statutory law. They can't do what they were doing before.
They've been hiding behind in the shadows. These FOIAs bring them to light.
How do we know? Because our FOIA litigation got that document.
Those of you that support the ACLJ, this is what it's all about at the end of the day.
Think we haven't been on this, folks? We've been on it.
I want to talk about this in this context also, and that is, let me go first to Andy. Andy, I'm looking at that. There's a couple of things that we would all agree could be changed. I don't want a monument to a Ku Klux Klan leader or a founder of the Ku Klux Klan. I accept the need for a memorial or a monument, though, for people like Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, the very founders of the country that we live in. They were not perfect men. They were not without flaw. No one is. They were a product of their times. They're not a product of the 1977, this is interesting, they're not products of the 1977 D.C. Human Rights Act, however, applying in 1776 or 1789.
Look, you look at people in the context of the generation, of the century, and of the time in which they lived, and you judge them by those standards, not by the standards of today or by the standards of tomorrow. We judge them by what they were and what they did at the time. The contributions that Jefferson and Washington made were tremendous contributions to the founding of the country. We built memorials to them. Greek revival architecture, should we take that down because Greeks in ancient times had slaves? That means we should destroy every building in Washington, D.C. that is built in the Greek revival type of architecture. That's how ridiculous it gets. And let me say something else that a lot of people don't know. At the end of the Civil War, the Marine Band stood outside the White House. And President Lincoln said, I want you to play a song. And they said, what do you want us to play, Mr. President? And he leaned out the window and said, Dixie. Should we now condemn President Abraham Lincoln, one of the greatest presidents the United States has ever had, and made a statement that could be construed in the year 2020 as being racist? Or was he trying to reach out to the conquered and to be reconstructed?
There's a whole history. There's a whole history about why he did that. And Harry Hutchison, our director of policy, is joining us. But there was a whole history of why Lincoln said play that. It was this reconciliation mode and to bring the southern states back into the country. You could criticize it, and you could come 100 reasons why that wasn't a good idea. But in Lincoln's view, there was a reason to do it. Putting that aside, Harry, this is a cancellation culture. When we say that, what are we talking about?
Well, essentially, Jay, we're talking about individuals who oppose reconciliation, who oppose, actually, American history. In essence, the move by the D.C. committee to recommend changes to the Washington Monument, the Jefferson Memorial, and other historical assets is simply the first step in a long desired process in abolishing history as part of the Democratic Party's relentless support for perfectionism, including the retroactive prosecution of the past and past historical figures based on the current D.C. human rights statute. This is a massively ridiculous campaign that does nothing for the people of Washington, D.C., except make politicians feel better about themselves. And so next, the D.C. committee will likely decide that the English language itself and math are systematically racist. This is ridiculous.
Let me ask you this. So if you've got a controversial, there's a controversial history with all of our founders because they were a product of their times. How would you handle it, Harry?
Well, you could develop a balanced approach. You could have a bipartisan commission. You could have individuals who are actually interested in preserving and actually interested in contextualizing history. We are not a perfect people. This is not a perfect country. But what we really have at hand here with this D.C. committee is the relentless pursuit of perfectionism. And the Democrats conveniently forget their own racist past. So are the members of the D.C. committee prepared to support the defunding, for instance, of the Democratic Party itself? Are they willing to support criminal justice reforms like the Justice Act proposed by Tim Scott? Are they willing to support school choice, which would disproportionately improve the lives of African Americans and Hispanic Americans? On many of these issues, the Democratic Party, the D.C. committee is found wanting. So in my judgment, this is not a serious attempt to rebalance the history of the United States.
So the questions being asked on Facebook are interesting. Aren't these federal monuments? What gives the mayor the right to go after them? Are they going to ask for Monticello and Mount Vernon to be torn down also? What's next? Renaming Washington, D.C. was exactly what Logan said. That's the comments coming in on Facebook. And there's a reason why those comments are coming in. Tell people why it's coming in.
Don't give them ideas.
Don't give them any ideas, by the way. They might actually do that.
So the reason this is happening is the organization DC Faces, which is part of the government of the District of Columbia, has put out a list and a bunch of requirements to rename, replace, or not even rename, replace, remove, or contextualize things like the Washington Monument, the Jefferson Memorial, amongst many others on this list. Christopher Columbus, sort of the people that are now the biggest target when some of these people are people who helped found this country. And not only that, is they're putting them under the rule of law of 2020 and saying if these people ever violated human rights laws of today, 200 years ago, they should have their names removed. They should no longer be celebrated. And sort of your defense of that is there'd be nothing to be celebrated without some of those people.
Yeah. So
without George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, good luck, America.
Fan, will you explain to people what it would be like in Washington D.C. with these gone? I mean, you live there. I mean, I live there too, obviously on and off, and half the year usually. I mean, I'm just trying to even visualize this.
Well, it'd be darn near empty, Jay, and there would also be no real celebration of our past because so much of the city is laid out in a way where you actually do literally walk through the history and the formation of our country. Jay, I was glad to see the Facebook commenter ask about how this would actually happen because the only thing that the D.C. mayor can do is use her position on the National Capital Memorial Advisory Commission to recommend the removal of at least the federal monuments. Jay, that would go two places. First of all, it would go to the National Park Service, overseen by the Secretary of Interior. We've already said that he has said this is not going to happen on his watch. But here's the other interesting thing, Jay.
But it's going to be a debate question in the presidential debates. I guarantee it.
100%. But the reason I mentioned that is because I wanted to layer on top of it the congressional level. The hearings would take place in the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee, Jay, that is chaired by Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, and the ranking member, Jay, it's Joe Manchin of West Virginia. Do you think this is going to have resonance with Joe Manchin of West Virginia? If it does, I'll be very surprised.
Yeah, but I mean, the fact of the matter is, Harry, it's going to be a question in the debates. You know it.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I would anticipate is that Joe Biden would have difficulty coming up with a constructive, if not articulate answer. Because Joe Biden is being pulled in two distinct directions, and based on the recent past, more likely than not, he will have to side with the left-wingers in his party, or he will lose their support.
Because of your support, because of the support of every member of the ACLJ, one of the practice areas that we've been able to develop is Freedom of Information Act requests, or FOIA requests.
It's thousands of pages of paper, and in those thousands of pages of paper, you usually find a nugget.
Government agencies acting out of control.
We have exposed that in our FOIA litigation, and we do that every day that we bring these cases.
It is your statutory right as an American citizen to have access to documents that reveal how the government is functioning, how your government is functioning.
We took it to the IRS. No one ever does that.
What the IRS was doing was violating the Constitution and statutory law. They can't do what they were doing before.
They've been hiding behind in the shadows. These FOIAs bring them to light.
How do we know? Because our FOIA litigation got that document.
Those of you that support the ACLJ, this is what it's all about at the end of the day.
Think we haven't been on this, folks? We've been on it.
All right, let's go to the phones. This is obviously about the situation going on in Washington, D.C.
Recast it for everybody.
Yeah, if you didn't know, there was a document circulated today from the District of Columbia Facilities and Commemorative Expressions Department from the mayor. And it specifically goes into the replacing, removing, or contextualizing some of the top Washington, D.C. monuments, parks, school names. And look, some of these, as we've said, are controversial and maybe should be adjusted. But you're talking about names like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, the classic founding fathers, the ones everyone knows about. And also, they happen to be the biggest tourist attractions in Washington, D.C. And so if you have a question or comment on that, give us a call, or on the other, 1-800-684-3110. That's 1-800-684-3110. Let's go to the phones, though. Let's go to Julie, who's calling in Iowa. Great state of Iowa, on line 2. You're on the air.
Hey, Julie.
Hi. Hi, gentlemen. My question is, why is the cancel culture criminalizing men from the past who were not criminals of their time, but are letting actual criminals of our time do whatever they want?
And I want to go to Harry and Andy first here. And Harry, define what are we seeing? This is the cancellation culture being implemented, but let's define it again for everybody so everybody understands what we're talking about.
Well, Jay, increasingly the United States is defined by what divides us. And so we have now succumbed to what might be called identity culture or identity politics. And so that is essentially tearing the nation apart. And much of this, the impetus for this, is grounded in the notion of grievance and victimhood. And I think it represents, at bottom, the miseducation of the American people, particularly young people, at elite educational institutions who have evinced evidence of their hatred for the United States itself. And so if you look at the New York Times with their 1619 project, they essentially claim that the United States was grounded in slavery. Well, they're absolutely wrong, because the Jamestown settlement occurred 12 years before 1619. And so the United States was not founded, for instance, on slavery. But nonetheless, many of these advocates from the Black Lives Matter movement, from Antifa, from left-wing members of the Democratic Party, they believe that the United States founding was wrong, and essentially it must be turned down or removed. In addition to which, of course, they have now turned their attention from monuments to math, to English itself. All of those things have to go because they represent suppression, subjugation, and victimhood.
And Andy, as a historian, you said this earlier, I think it bears repeating. We don't have a perfect history. These are not perfect men and women. None of us are. And the idea that there was errors, mistakes made, policies that we find now abhorrent, violating our conscience, but this was 200 years ago. And what the New York, D.C. did was say, we're going to apply the D.C. Human Rights Statute from 1977 back to the founding of our country.
Well, you don't do that. You don't rewrite history. History is the story of the change through time. That's what history is. and the history of human reality, the history of the intervention of God in human life, the great event of the incarnation of Christ. All these things are events that occurred. You cannot deny them. What you do from them is you learn from the errors of the past and you try to repeat it. He who does not know history is doomed to repeat it again. You don't condemn, you don't knock down monuments. You understand that they were put up at a time and a place and for a specific reason, and you learn and you look at these as a learning experience, and you don't victimize everybody. You cannot. We're all victims if you look at it that way. The country is a victim-founded country, and we are hypocrites if we keep saying over and over that we've got to change what America is. America is, for all its faults, still the beacon for what is free and just and right in the world. And these statues and these men and these monuments, with all their faults and all their foibles and all the things that they did wrong, nonetheless did right and good and just things, and that is what we should concentrate on and not the bad traits.
Will on Facebook said, it seems like people are confusing the point of the monuments. Not all of them are to celebrate every action of every person associated. Andy's right. We will remove any semblance of history and the ability to have meaningful conversations. Yeah. Then Kristen on Facebook.
Yeah, Christine, this is an interesting comment. I think this is one that maybe we could help settle people down, but I don't know if we can. She said, is this at a point where legal action can be initiated, or is this such a ridiculous request that it probably won't even get to that point? Well, I'll tell you this first, Christine, if you're watching on Facebook. Some time went into this. This was not like
Logan's holding up the report.
Yeah, you're talking about pages and pages and beautifully graphic designed report.
Serious.
This didn't just come out of thin air. They didn't just write an email that said, "Hey, we should replace the Washington Monument."
These are federal monuments. And number one, the District of Columbia cannot remove federal monuments. So, in fact, it would take acts of Congress to remove these. But I'm going to tell you, and we'll save the debate part. It's going to come up in the debates, and they will be pressed to take a stand on these issues. But let's talk about it from a legal standpoint, and congressionally. It would take congressional action to remove this in the District of Columbia because D.C.'s Congress is basically the legislature for the D.C.
They could pass a statute to remove the monuments or the statues. Jay, I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think she would even get bipartisan support for that. But I would tell you this. This recommendation might seem unbelievable, but Jay, it has to be believable. It's here.